You know, US-25 does something you don't see very often anymore. It splits. There's a 25W and a 25E, two branches heading off in completely different directions through Tennessee and Kentucky. Now, this wasn't unusual when the US highway system was first put together, but most of these split routes eventually faded out. They didn't vanish from the map, they were usually turned over to state or local control once the federal system stopped supporting them. This one, however, didn't. And that caught my attention again. Yeah, I've talked about it before. I mentioned it briefly in a short last year, but after releasing the recent US-25 video about it being erased by Interstate 75, a lot of people brought it up in the comments, and it made me stop and think. Maybe it's time to step back and look at the whole picture again. So today, we're starting a new series called Highway Logic. It's where we investigate some of the oddities, quirks, and unanswered questions in America's roads. We're going to break this down and figure out exactly why US 25 ended up with two branches and why both of them are still on the map when so many others have gone by the wayside. And the best place to start is with the land itself. Because every road has a reason, and we're here to find it as we go beyond the exit. Start with the land. When you're trying to understand why a highway does something unusual, the first place to look is the land it's crossing. And once you study the terrain US 25 has to move through, the picture starts to clear up almost immediately. Eastern Tennessee and southeastern Kentucky sit in a part of the Appalachian region known for its long, narrow ridges. On the older topographical maps and early highway surveys, these ridges show up like someone dragged their fingers across the landscape in evenly spaced lines. They run northeast to southwest, one after another, with deep valleys carved between them. Travel in this region tended to follow those valleys. Not because people never crossed the ridges, they certainly did, but because the valleys offered the most reliable practical corridors for long-distance movement. Ridgetop paths and steep mountain crossings existed, but they rarely became the backbone of major through routes. And once you see the patterns on the maps, the question shifts a little bit. Instead of asking why there are two pathways through here, it's easier to ask where else could it have gone. One of those corridors heads toward the Cumberland Gap, the one major natural opening in the entire ridge system. This pathway is most closely followed by US 25E. The western corridor is a different story. Those valleys offered another long-established route north and south, one early railroads relied on, such as the Louisville and Nashville. That infrastructure helped define the general path that later became US 25W. So the eastern route followed the Wilderness Road and overlaid it, and the western route followed the path carved out by the railroad, pathways that had been discovered as the easiest routes through the area many years before. Not too hard to see, right? And once you do, you realize that the split wasn't created by planners. It was inherited. The horseless carriage. When the automobile finally arrived on the scene, the two roads became a portion of what we know as the Dixie Highway Association. And that's when a strong sibling rivalry began between the two roads. You see, the 25E corridor as we know it today was designated as the main route. It turns out 25W wasn't even recognized at first. Towns along this stretch were furious and fought for recognition by lobbying the association. Finally, in 1924, they not only relented, but declared that pathway the official route and downgraded the 25E corridor across the gap to an official alternate route. But of course, the Dixie Highway Association is no more, and all that was about to change in 1926 with the creation of the numbered highway system, solidifying that original decision. Why the split became official. When the U.S. highway system took shape in the 1920s, the idea was simple. One highway, one number, one clear route. But in general, those rules also stated that a two-digit number had to represent a major continuous corridor, not a short stretch of road, or one that might even end at a state line. That created a problem for US 25. When it reached Corbin, Kentucky, it had a difficult decision to make. which of these very viable pathways should it follow? The eastern route carried travelers through the Cumberland Gap and connected towns like Middlesboro and Corbin, not to mention the tri-state area in the mountains around the Gap. The western route went through Knoxville, Jellicoe, Williamsburg, and finally ended up at Corbin as well, carrying the brunt of freight and business. Neither path worked as a separate two-digit highway. They weren't two unrelated roads. They were two halves of the same north-south movement through the Appalachians, shaped by terrain and history long before the highway system had ever shown up. So the planners kept both paths under one family, US-25E and US-25W. A workaround that seemed to be gaining popularity across the country in situations like this. And a busy pair of roads they were. And I thought this might be a great place to drop in a real-world example of how important US 25 and the split was before the interstates. There was so much traffic through this area and potential business, not to mention tourists, that an aspiring businessman chose this as his home location to build a gas station, a motor court, and a restaurant that would later become a worldwide brand. That'd be Mr. Harland Sanders, who most people just know as the Colonel. Sanders built his business just after the split between 25W and 25E, serving families traveling north and south, regional drivers moving between towns, and long lines of tourists headed to Florida. It was a busy, dependable corridor, and before the white suit, the buckets, and the global brand, US 25 was the road that kept his doors open. In fact, Beyond the Exit did a full story on the history behind Harland Sanders and the first Colonel Sanders location. I'll leave a link at the end of the video if you'd like to check it out. It wasn't erased by the interstate. When the interstate system arrived in the mid-20th century, a lot of older U.S. highways saw their roles shrink. In many places, the new freeways replaced the long-distance traffic those roads once carried, and split routes were some of the first to disappear. But along US 25, that didn't happen, and there's a good reason. 25W stayed in use because it continued serving the valley towns and everyday local traffic, mainly because in some instances the interstate was quite a ways away from the original road, handling regional destinations that the freeway wasn't designed to handle. US 25E moved in a different direction. Instead of fading, it was upgraded. The corridor was widened, straightened, and eventually linked through the Cumberland Gap tunnels, turning it into a safer, more modern route without redesigning it as an interstate. In several stretches, you still find at-grade access, which is a reminder that this is a U.S. highway at heart, even after all of the improvements. There were conversations decades ago about simplifying the numbering system and removing the split, but those ideas never moved beyond proposals. In the end, both branches kept their designations because both still had a lot of work to do. One continued serving the valley communities, and the other became a modernized mountain approach. The logic still holds true. When you look at these two corridors today, you can still see the logic that created them a century ago. The interstate carries the long-distance traffic, but the split survives because each branch still fills a role the other can't. Now, US 25W remains pretty much the same as it always has over the years. Not much has changed since the interstate era. Of course, in Kentucky, it still functions as a parallel route and a jump-off for I-75. US 25E holds on to its historic background, leaning into the mountain crossing it was built around. The Cumberland Gap Tunnel modernized the route, but it didn't change its reason for being. Harrogate, Middlesboro, and Pineville, and the whole tri-state area there, all rely on the East Side Corridor as a direct link through terrain that doesn't offer many other options. Put together, the two routes aren't leftovers. They're actually modern expressions of old decisions that still make sense. One branch follows the valleys and towns, the other follows the gap and the regional flow. Different jobs, but both still definitely needed. And as we said at the beginning of our video, every road has a reason. And with 25W and 25E, I'm pretty sure we found it. Well, we really hope you enjoyed the video on 25W and 25E today. The first in our series called Highway Logic, where we kind of explore quirky splits and unusual things that roads do. Maybe you got a road that you're dying for us to cover. If so, please leave it in the comments and we'll do our best to get it on the list. Also, if you'd like to help us out and you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click that like button. It goes a lot further on YouTube when you do. And if you've got a friend that you would like to share it with, go ahead and let them know about it. Maybe they'd enjoy it too. I wanted to say thank you very much to all our subscribers and viewers. We just crossed 20,000 subscribers. That's a substantial milestone for us, and we're very excited about what the future holds for the channel. As always, we're going to keep digging for history hiding in plain sight and telling stories from the roads that move us. You all have been quite amazing to us, and we're deeply grateful. We definitely know you could be other places, so we're glad you're here. We want to thank you for watching and say God bless.